Welcome everyone. I'm Mark Chaplin from the Information Security Forum, and today I'll be talking to you about identifying and protecting your organization's critical information assets. I'm standing in for Steve Durbin today, who can't make the presentation, and if any of you were actually expecting to hear Steve's voice today, don't worry. As the lead author of much of this work, you're in good hands with me today. Just a few things before we start. This platform is pretty reliable, but if any of you have any experiences typically with sound, please try and log in again. That often works. Throughout the session, please use the platform to ask me any questions. There's always plenty to come, and I'll try and deal with them as we work through the slide deck. If we don't get to some of those questions, I'll try and pick them up at the end. But if we don't get to all the questions, or even after the session you have a burning question you want to ask us here at the ISF, please email us with the contact details on the last slide. At the end of the session, I will be providing Steve's contact details, so if you've got any follow-up questions, queries, any interest in anything that I share with you, please contact Steve. I am contactable at the ISF, also on Twitter and LinkedIn if you want to know any of the low-down detailed aspects of these slides I'm about to present. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. So first of all, just to set the scene, a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you over the next 40 minutes or so is based on a lot of work that we've done over the last few years, focusing on how organizations protect their most valuable information assets. It's actually something we refer to as the crown jewels within the ISF. It might be a term that you use within your organization. But there is also a very strong theme of our risk assessment methodology called IRAM2, and also the Standard Good Practice for Information Security, which is our flagship product. So any of you that are members, or if you're familiar with any of this work, you'll see a lot of these themes running through the slide. Now, whenever you hear a CEO being interviewed on television and they're asked, what is your most valuable asset in the organization? Invariably, he or she will respond with, our employees are our most valuable asset. And of course, they need to say that. But when we started looking at this project a couple of years ago, it was very clear that within businesses, in organizations, there are a range of assets that the business leaders think about and are concerned about. And many of these assets are actually tangible, so they range from people, property, equipment, transportation, even raw materials. Of course, there are some other types of business assets that are particularly important, such as money in the bank, the organization's reputation in the marketplace, and so on. But of course, what we're really interested in as part of protecting and understanding your information assets is information itself. And of course, over the last 3 to 4 decades, the use of information has significantly grown to a point where it's incredibly valuable for organizations. There's a few statements on the current slide that just give you an idea of the scale of information that's being used by organizations around the world today. And of course, this is the focus of many of our roles within organizations, understanding what that information is, the dependency that organizations have on the information, and how it links to the success of the business. Now, we use a lot of models within the ISF when we're working on projects, and we use them with members as well. And here is a good example of a model that's particularly important when you're trying to understand what are the types of information assets being used within our organization, how is it being used, who has access, are we relying on any technology, does the information exist in different formats that might have implications on its value to the organization. In fact, in many organizations, the value of the information is reaching to points where it can even be registered on the organization's balance sheet. In some cases, some organizations consider that information represents 80 to 90% of the value of the organization. So clearly business leaders in organizations are starting to see and understand the significance of information and the part it plays within the organization's success, whether it's providing business services, developing products, or supporting business operations throughout the organization. Now, often people sometimes find themselves overlooking different types of information assets. Here is a good example of a wide range of information assets that may be important to your organization. With this project, there will particular focus on research and development, intellectual property, and also business and governance, so information such as strategy and mergers and acquisitions are just some examples of important information assets. The model on the right-hand side of this slide is particularly important. It plays an important part when you're trying to identify information assets within the organization, but also going through to protecting them as well. And you'll see some slides in a moment that build on this model, so please bear this in mind. But to describe it very simply, in many cases within an organization, people will use information, often through the use of physical devices, endpoint devices, to access a range of business applications, all of which sit on some form of technical infrastructure, and all of these different assets exist in a physical representation somewhere. So even if you're highly dependent on cloud services, there is a physical representation or manifestation of the technology being used to provide that. And when it comes to protecting your critical information assets, it's particularly important to understand all these different elements. Now, throughout the theme of these slides, there is a very strong risk assessment and risk management theme. But often when you're engaging with business leaders and business executives, one of the best and most simplest ways that you can convey some of the most important concepts is through using references to threats, assets, and protection. In fact, we call this the TAP diagram or the TAP model, and it's a very useful way of engaging with information owners, business leaders within the organization to help explain some of the complex topics and elements that I'm about to go through. So I want you to really think very carefully about this concept of threats, two assets that we need to protect, and I'll walk through each of these over the next set of slides. But before we do that, it's very important, particularly when you're looking at protecting your organization's most valuable information assets, your critical information assets, is to understand some basic characteristics about information assets, many of which are common and well understood, but also to understand some of the pitfalls and some of the weaknesses associated with those different characteristics. So the first one is format. If we think about information in a digital format, that is probably the most common. When we talk to security practitioners around the world, typically information in a digital format is the most common one that's discussed when we're looking at protection. But of course, information exists in a physical format, whether it's a printout from a digital format or whether information is just generated and conveyed in a physical format. So it could be a paper-based contract. It could be information being conveyed on a whiteboard or a flip chart. There are lots of different examples of information in a physical format, and sometimes these get overlooked. And then the third type is spoken, or what we could describe as human-related information. So this is information that people are generating themselves. I'm communicating with you now through my voice. So this is also an often overlooked format of information. And as we'll see in a few slides' time, you need to understand the significance of information in these three different formats. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the information lifecycle. And again, I don't need to teach you the different aspects of the information lifecycle. But again, when you're looking at identifying critical information assets in your organization, and also you're looking at applying a level of protection to them to protect against those threats, then there are some aspects of that life cycle that can often be overlooked. Two in particular are creation and destruction. And as we get into the solution, I'll explain a little bit more about some of the problems and some of the ways that you can address that. A concept that we use within the ISF is something called the footprint. So if you think about the three different formats of information associated with intellectual property, for example, and you think about the life cycle of that information, then the footprint represents all the different locations that information can exist, all the different places it might be transmitted to, all the people that might have access, all the different physical locations that information may reside. And that footprint is a very important part of helping understand and identify the critical information assets, all the way through to providing a balanced, comprehensive and end-to-end level of protection. Now, there are actually many different information characteristics that you need to consider, and there's quite a long list, but here are just three more examples that you need to think about when you embark on protection of information assets, particularly those that are critical to the organization. The purpose of the information asset is particularly important because it might support an existing business process, such as a manufacturing technique, for example. It might be information related to planning. It might be a future business strategy, or might be plans to acquire another organization, all the way through to decision making. It could also be information that represents products or services that you're going to bring to market in the next 2-3 years. And that again has a particular significance because often the purpose of an information asset can influence the level of motivation and capability of an adversarial threat. So it might be an unscrupulous competitor, it might be a rogue nation state, it might be an organized criminal group. Of course, we know today there are lots of different types of information that we're using in an organization, and that can range from structured through to unstructured, and again, that introduces its own complications that need to be considered. And then finally for this slide, a term that we refer to as volatility. So this refers to the amount and volume of information and the frequency with which it changes. So in some cases, a crown jewel might be information that is static. That might be a master list, for example, all the way through to information that's dynamic, which might be transactional information. And again, this is another characteristic which influences the risk to an information asset and also influences the type and level of control that you need to implement. So I just wanted to explain a little bit more about the footprint, because this is going to have significance when we come to looking at the risks associated with a critical information asset. So using that asset model that I explained just a moment ago, first of all, there is a people element. So information assets within your organization will be accessed by a range of different people. They will be people within the organization and outside the organization. They may be regulators, business partners. They may be internal staff, employees. So they might be people that have a high level of privilege. They may also be individuals that are involved in developing business strategies, such as business leaders, or they might be engineers involved in developing new products. I can see a question's just come in, so I'm just going to have a look. I can see someone's having a problem seeing the presentation slides. We'll see if we can address that, but I will continue for the benefit of everyone else on the call. So the people element is the first aspect that you need to consider when you're identifying information assets that are valuable to the business. And then that's followed by physical devices. So what type of physical devices are being used to access, manipulate, copy, support the information within its life cycle? And again, most of you will be familiar with laptops, tablets, smartphones, but when you're looking at protecting and managing the risks associated with your most valuable information assets, there is a very broad range of devices that you need to make sure you don't overlook. Some examples might be USB devices, they might be teleconference systems, they might be network printers, which are of a particular problem for many organizations today. In fact, I've seen organizations where they will lock down the technical infrastructure for an R&D department, for example, but leave the network printer exposed in an open plan office, which of course is a server in itself, can often have a disk space or a disk drive up to 2 terabytes. Anything sent to that printer or photocopied can reside on that printer in an unprotected environment. So the physical devices that are used by individuals to access and manipulate critical information assets is absolutely essential. Of course, all of those devices are typically used to access a range of business applications. Some of those might exist in the cloud. Some of them might exist or be managed by external parties. Some of them might be just applications that are running on desktop environments and embedded in your web browser. And we know with plugins and other configurable features of those applications, these can lead to some exposures that you need to be aware of. And of course, those applications and devices are dependent on a technical infrastructure. So it might be servers, server farms, databases, middleware, and obviously a range of supporting technologies such as network routers and security components all provide that infrastructure to support the processing of that information, and that is incredibly important. And then finally, all of these elements of the asset model exist in a physical location. So whether you have a data center internally, whether you've got devices being managed within discrete aspects of the business or areas of the business, that's particularly important to make sure you understand physically where that information resides, because when you come to protect it, that is particularly important. So that's the footprint. So we use the term in the ISEF crown jewel to represent a mission critical information asset. Within your organizations you may use different terms, but a crown jewel, traditionally using conventional risk assessment methods, is something that would have a significant, potentially catastrophic impact on the business if it was compromised. What we found working with many organizations around the world is when you perform a business impact assessment, which is an essential part of a risk assessment process, that often is a negative conversation that you're having with a business. You're describing scenarios that the business doesn't expect and they don't want. And what we found is if you turn that conversation on its head to a value conversation, you'll typically find you'll have a far more positive conversation with an information owner or a business leader within the organization. So the same concepts apply of what are the different positive impact types of the business. Can an information asset be directly linked to a revenue generating process? Can an information asset provide opportunities to provide efficiencies in manufacturing, for example? Can an information asset be directly linked to your organization's position in the marketplace? Does it help you maintain a leading position, or will it help you gain more market share? So this is some of the thinking that we explored as part of the project, and as a result we've identified an approach that involves both a traditional conventional impact assessment approach but also a valuation approach to help identify the most valuable information assets within an organization. Typically, in most organizations, you will not identify more than 20 to 25 most critical information assets. That is not to say that many of the information assets that you've identified are not important, but typically, if you have a level of categorization or classification within your organization, the crown jewels are typically a subset of the highest. And hopefully that slide is emphasizing that relationship between what we refer to as mission critical information assets, or critical information assets as you might call it, compared to other types of assets of high value but not necessarily the most important. Now this is a particularly important concept because often when you're talking to an information owner within your organization and they believe their information asset is the most important, often it will be identified as a level down from mission critical or crown jewel. So on this slide I'm giving you an example. Let's assume that we've zoomed in on the highest level of categorization of information within your organization, and you could break that down into tiers, so it might be mission critical, critical and high. What we're focusing on with crown jewels and critical information assets is just that top tier, and I'm providing an example here of trade secrets, market analysis, cryptographic information. These in some organizations might be the most valuable information assets, and the ones that they will focus on first when they're looking to manage risk and apply the necessary level of protection. It doesn't mean that anything below that top line isn't important to the organization. It's just a concept of prioritizing between different types of information assets. And this is just one way that you can represent it. One thing that we have identified working with organizations is this is not something that you will determine and implement overnight. So many organizations that run a program of work over 2 or 3 years will find that during that period of time, some of these information assets will be promoted to the highest level, that is a crown jewel, and then other information assets over time will be identified as not being as important and may be relegated. So this is often a very fluid movement of information assets and something that will emerge and become clearer over time. There are a number of triggers that we find in organizations that will lead to a project or a program of work or an initiative focusing on critical information assets. Here are some examples, and it's something that in your organization you may already have identified or experienced. So if you have experienced a major incident that involved a high-value information asset, or maybe a competitor or another organization in your industry sector has experienced one, that might trigger a focus on these particular information assets. But also failure of security assessments or audits, merger and acquisition activity is a very common trigger for identifying information assets. Whether you're selling off part of the organization or whether you're acquiring part of another organization. Of course, if the CEO or a business executive comes up to you and tells you that they have a crown jewel that needs protecting, then much of the solution that I'm going to walk through briefly would actually apply. There is one thing that's particularly unique about an organization's most critical information assets. Often it's information that they've generated for their own purposes. And the reason why I say that is because often crown jewel information is very different to privacy-related information and credit card-related information. Those two examples often find themselves in the news on a regular basis, and the Equifax breach is just a perfect example of that. Typically what you'll find with regards to an organization's most valuable information assets, which is in many cases intellectual property, so it could be trade secrets, pre-patent information, algorithms, recipes, formulas, manufacturing techniques. There's a very, very long list of potential crown jewels within your organization. But often they will not find themselves in the media or in news headlines, typically because organizations will take extensive steps to protect the exposure or the release of that. But on this slide there are a number of examples of intellectual property related breaches, and within your organization you just need to be aware of the impact of the organization should something actually happen. But obviously there's a clear need to protect your most valuable information assets, and to do that you need to understand the threat landscape to each of those information assets throughout the organization. We use a number of models, one of which here focuses on the adversarial threat. So many organizations that are trying to protect their intellectual property or similar information are trying to protect against particular types of threats such as nation-state, unscrupulous competitors and hacktivists, against exposure, against theft. And what you'll typically find, whatever organization the industry sector your organization operates in, will often influence the type of threat that you need to protect against. And again, on this slide, there are just a few examples of the types of threat, the typical industry sector that they will target, and the types of information assets that they're trying to access, such as state secrets, customer lists, and research and development details. Just building on that threat landscape, many organizations, many of our ISF members use something called the cyber attack chain. So any of those threats, such as an organized criminal group, will use a number of techniques and methods. We refer to them as threat events. And they will typically go through a number of stages, from performing reconnaissance, which is trying to understand more information about the organization, the people, the infrastructure, through to gaining access. So that might be developing targeted phishing campaigns, deploying targeted malware, all the way through to deploying people within the organization or trying to coerce and bribe internal staff. When threats are successful in getting access to the organization, they will attempt to maintain control, so create backdoors, escalate privileges, create remote access points. And then once they've done that, the fourth step is they are then looking at compromising information, which in the case of crown jewels and high-value information assets, this is where that information is being extracted out of the organization. The final step, which you typically won't see in most kill chains, is actually what that group or that individual, that threat, will do once they've accessed that information. So misappropriating trade secrets is a good example of how intellectual property will typically be used once it's been stolen out of an organization. So if you're familiar with a kill chain in your organization, this is effectively a similar thing. And what we've done within the ISF, working with leading organizations, is we've developed a way of using this cyber attack chain to understand and profile threats that are targeting your organization's most valuable information assets. So on the right-hand side, you'll just see an example of what this representation looks like, and we call this the threat visualizer, which is just one of many tools that you can use to sit down with an information owner or business executives to help them understand the complexities of protecting the critical information asset, understand the different techniques and how they might be used to target that particular information asset. So this is just giving you an example of one technical method that you can use to walk through and understand if our protection, if our security controls and solutions are breached at each layer of protection, what does that mean for the organization, and what can the organization expect if you have a sophisticated targeted attacker targeting a particular information asset. And then finally, from a threat perspective, you need to understand what the exposure is of that information asset. And again, you'll see the footprint here. This is a conceptual diagram trying to emphasize with an information asset, if it's of particular value to the business and it's targeted by an adversarial threat of some kind, you need to make sure that you consider all the different aspects that might introduce an exposure. So any of you that are risk analysts or risk managers, you'll be very familiar with a theme that's running through here, which is around threat profiling, threat assessment, and performing a vulnerability assessment. So whatever methods that you're using within your organization, this is where you would be applying them. So if we understand what crown jewels are, our critical information assets within the organization, and you go through a process of trying to prioritize them and identify the top 10, the top 20, and we have an understanding of what that threat landscape looks like, you know, who's targeting them, how are they targeting them, are they sophisticated, are they highly capable, are they committed, what motivates them. It's at this point we need to sit down and think about, okay, what are the requirements? What are our objectives to protect these critical information assets? And there are some principles that you need to apply. Some of them you already apply across your estate at the moment. Some of them may not be obvious to you. But you want to reduce the risk exposure. You want to reduce the size of that footprint as much as possible, because the smaller the footprint, the greater control you'll have over protecting against those threats. You need greater threat visibility. So that threat landscape that I talked about, it's absolutely essential that you understand what that threat landscape looks like and that you're able to prioritize and understand where are those threats coming from, which are the ones that are most prominent, which ones you need to focus on. Just some other objectives here that I think are worth pulling out. The flexible and agile protection is particularly important, particularly if you have valuable information asset that changes over time. So financial information has a pattern where it peaks every quarter and then drops off. Whereas in the case of a trade secret, for example, that will always have a high value associated with it. So you would typically always apply the best level of protection that you can provide. The principle here with these objectives is if you've identified something that is a critical information asset, you need to apply protection that is bigger, better, and faster than any other protection that you're providing throughout your organization. So you need to be providing more monitoring so that you're aware in real time if anything unusual or suspicious happens. You need to be able to respond quickly once you've detected something, so focused incident management. And all of the controls and measures that you put in place to protect a high-value information asset needs to have a level of assurance associated with it, so you can go back to the information owner, business executives, business leaders, and convince them and provide them with assurance that they are being protected adequately. So when you're looking at the footprint of an information asset, particularly one that is a crown jewel, you want to reduce its size and complexity. You want to maintain as much control as possible. For crown jewels, you might find you have a zero tolerance for using cloud services, providing access to external parties, whether it's external consultants or business partners and such. You want to be able to restrict access as much as possible to people, applications, devices. You want to probably isolate critical information assets. So this might be segmenting on a network all the way through to isolating in a physical environment. And then finally concealing critical information, which technically might involve encryption, but physically may involve some other measures where you are making sure that only a limited number of people have access to a particular part of facilities within your premises, for example. So when you're looking at protection for your most valuable information assets, there are a number of things that you need to consider. The ones that we focus on in detail are those that are advanced, balanced, and end-to-end. So what we mean by that, advanced is you're looking at applying controls that are preventative, detective, and reactive in nature. We also talk about informative controls, which I'll mention in a moment, and also follow-up controls, which I'll explain a little bit. But you need advanced means that you're covering all aspects. Balanced means we're looking at implementing controls that operate before, during, and after an event. So again, before would be any form of early warning system that you can implement. During means you've got real-time detection in place. And after means you've got very strong incident management and crisis management capabilities in place. Absolutely essential for crown jewels. And then end-to-end protection means you are taking into account the complete life cycle of that information within that footprint. So you're in particular not just focusing on processing, storing, and transmitting, but you're taking into account information when it's being created, if it's a high valuable information asset, and also taking into account measures to make sure that you provide as much assurance as possible that you've destroyed that information asset when it's no longer required. Automated, fast, and resilient are just other examples of considerations when you're identifying and evaluating security controls. And the resilience is a particularly important one for crown jewels because you'll find many organizations see their security infrastructure being targeted if a sophisticated attacker is trying to reach a crown jewel. So whether it's your intrusion detection systems, your malware systems, organizations find they're increasingly becoming under attack themselves in order to bypass them and get through that cyber attack chain. We use a concept of fundamental, enhanced, specialized. Again, in your organization, you may have different layers of controls that you implement. It might be influenced by your security architecture or a controls framework that you're using. Fundamental controls are typically those that are baseline or default. You might enhance them so that you're increasing or tweaking the level of protection that those controls apply. But in most cases, when you're dealing with high-value information assets, you'll also be considering a range of specialized security controls, and these are the ones that are often unique or radical. They wouldn't necessarily be practical across the organization as a whole, but they're often very effective when you're looking at protecting high-value information assets. You may have a range of security solutions already in place that you can leverage. We often see a range of these security solutions being provided, from endpoint security, automated classification, all the way through to a PKI that might support a broader range of products. So it's no surprise to see intrusion detection, intrusion prevention there, all the way through to using SIEM. So many organizations, when they start protecting crown jewels, are implementing a number of these products to provide that layered protection and defense in depth. When you're evaluating security controls and solutions, again, you probably do a number of these already for information assets throughout your organization. But in the case of crown jewels, you need to make sure that those solutions and controls provide extensive coverage of the footprint. You need to consider all the different security requirements, particularly some of those that might be unique for crown jewels. And also you need to think about the impact on the business user, the organization as a whole, and also as an information security function. If it's going to have any impact on staffing, training levels, upfront and ongoing costs, all of those need to be considered. So just as we come towards the end of the session, I just want to highlight that there are many different approaches that organizations take to protect their most valuable information assets, often because those information assets are unique and vary significantly. So one organization has a spreadsheet on a laptop that's kept in a safe that is accessible 3 or 4 times a year by the board of directors and no one else, because it contains highly sensitive information about business strategy, mergers and acquisitions. At the end of the spectrum, you have organizations that have crown jewel information that is publicly available. So it's intellectual property that's protected through copyright, for example, or through patents. So the nature of those information assets means the approach can often be very, very different. So we have designed an approach, or 2 key approaches that are proving very popular. The first is what we call a threat-based approach. So I talked about the cyber attack chain and the threat visualizer. If you as an organization have a mature information risk assessment methodology and you are actually focusing on the threat, so you've identified an unscrupulous competitor that you know is targeting your organization, then the threat-based approach will allow you to use that cyber attack chain and consider what kind of specialized controls and solutions might we put in place in order to protect against each of those layers of cyber attack chain. So some examples of advanced specialized controls that we are starting to see in leading organizations would include the use of good quality threat intelligence combined with an insider threat program. So you're starting to get information that might indicate an emerging or imminent attack. That also extends to honeypots and decoy systems that might give you a warning before you actually see any activity within your organization or on your network. From a preventative and detective approach, you want to apply both controls in a balanced format, and specialized approaches would include things like behavioral analysis, baselining activity, not just on your network, but across your organization as a whole, to get an understanding of what anonymous suspicious activity might look like. And then from a reactive perspective, organizations are looking at dedicated incident management teams that can respond immediately should something happen. And in the case of crown jewels, particularly because they are often irreversible if they're exposed to an unauthorized party, you'll see with react and follow-up activities an increased emphasis on legal activity, performing forensics, collecting information, working with your insurance company, for example, for cover. So just some examples there of some unique, specialized, advanced controls that organizations will typically implement to help inform them of something happening, prevent, detect if something's bypassed, and then be able to follow up once you've detected something. So that's what we refer to as a threat-based approach. But I talked about the information lifecycle, and again, another popular approach is an information lifecycle based approach. So that is looking at your control framework and selecting and identifying specialized security controls that would apply at each stage of the life cycle, the information life cycle. So again, here are some examples of what we refer to as specialized or advanced security controls. Some of them you may apply in your own organization as a matter of default, and that's okay. But if you don't, certainly consider some of these when you're looking to protect information when it's being created. So making sure that information is being classified clearly according to your information classification scheme, making sure information is being created in a secure environment, whether physical or digital. Processing information and storing and transmitting information, don't forget the different formats. Don't assume that it's just in a digital format. Physical and spoken formats are also just as important. And we find that sophisticated threats will often target the weakest point. So in one organization where the backups were targeted, they were being targeted through the physical couriering of those backup devices purely because the database and the infrastructure was locked down. So don't make any assumptions when you're looking at the life cycle. And then the destruction one is the one that requires some advanced planning, because in the case of destruction you need to understand where that information is. You need a very good understanding of that footprint. But of course there are lots of products and solutions out there that can destroy information, whether it's in a digital format or in a physical format. Of course, it's different for information that is in a spoken form, but again, there are techniques that you can use such as non-disclosure agreements, exit interviews, and other methods organizations use to try and manage exposure of valuable information assets, certainly if they're known by a particular individual. And then finally, we find as organizations start applying the necessary level of protection to their most valuable information assets, they need to embed that in their business as usual activities, their standard operating systems. So you will find that there are typically 4 areas that you need to focus on. One is looking at general governance, risk management and compliance activities. You need a strong foundation if you're going to apply the necessary level of protection to your crown jewels across the organization. You need to engage with the right people and instill and emphasize the need for ownership. Obviously, technology is an important part. That's where most of your effort will be spent. And for security assurance, it's absolutely essential that you apply a process of continuous improvement to make sure that you're constantly refining, understanding the level of risk, understanding the level of protection on an ongoing basis. So that's a little bit of a high-level view at how you would identify and protect information assets that are the most valuable within your organization. And I've just got some key takeaways for you which I think are absolutely essential. I think these are things that you can apply within your organization today, whatever level of maturity you're at. When you embark on an activity of protecting your organization's most valuable information assets, don't underestimate the scale of the challenge. This is not something that you can do in 4 to 6 weeks. Don't expect an organization to come in and identify all your crown jewels and help you address the risk in that period of time. Many organizations spend years evolving and developing this particular approach. Some of you may have seen some of those slides and thought it's just not practical to take that approach for protecting information assets. Often if that's the case, then you're probably not dealing with the organization's most valuable information assets. Detail matters. The 3 different formats of information, the complete life cycle, the footprint for your crown jewels within your organization needs to be understood and needs to be refined over time. I talked to you about the threats assets protection model. This is a very simple and effective way of communicating with information owners and business leaders. And I would also ask that you be realistic about what is and what isn't a crown jewel. If you can manage it to about 25, that would be ideal. If you think you're mature enough and you have a capability to deal with and manage more, then that's fine. So you need to understand that cyber attack chain. You need to apply protection that is commensurate with the level of risk. And I would encourage all of you to commit, once you embark on a journey, commit to applying that level of protection, because it's absolutely essential. You can leverage any existing investment you've made, whether it's tools, whether it's staff, skills, expertise that you have in place. I would encourage you to look at that, but don't expect a quick result. This is a 6 to 12-month program at least, and ongoing. And as you improve over time and you get a handle on your crown jewels, you'll find that you can cascade good practice down to the rest of your infrastructure and your information assets. So on that note, I'd like to thank all of you very much for your patience and your time. Really appreciate that and hope you got some value out of it. I'm showing you Steve Durbin, our Managing Director's details. If you've got anything you would like to follow up on, please get in touch with Steve Durbin. If you've got any questions, queries, if you're interested in learning more, please get in touch with Steve, but you'll also be able to get hold of me online as well. I think just finally, one thing, the slides will be available. If you email Steve for access to the slide deck, Steve will be very glad to share them with you. And again, thank you very much and goodbye.